Hello guys! Welcome back to Not Just Mecha. It's Marco here, and today we speed paint a clean sci-fi model with oils. I know, it's been a while since the last episode dedicated to Infinity, but I never stopped painting in the background my O12 army. So I've accumulated models and footage that I can finally release thanks to the recent reboot of the oil painting series. After all the fantasy and very organic models of the last few weeks, I want to use Infinity's clean sci-fi to show you another interesting general approach to oils, and how you can use their finer properties on small, flat surfaces, painting a complex armor in a super quick and effective non-metallic metal. So quick and effective that, for the first time, I was worried about not having enough footage for a video. To understand the complex relations of the scheme on my first explorative model, I used as main reference its simplified concept art. But my color scheme has quickly evolved into something a bit less saturated and cartoony, and more inspired to the moody box art, where the armors are often rendered in a shinier non-metallic metal. Still full of grit and battle damages, especially on heavily armored soldiers like this Omega unit. With a couple of test models, I defined this process that I can quickly set in motion every time I have a bit of spare time, and that can give me a finished model in a little more than 1 hour. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to always know what happens on the channel. And if you want to support my work, like, comment, share, watch another video, and maybe check my Patreon page, where you can find the real-time footage of my videos, with every single little line and brushstroke. Thanks a million, guys! In the last few videos, you saw me using an acrylic base tone for some of the main elements of the models, but in this case the only steps made in acrylics are priming and zenithal light. As you saw, Radukar the Beast, working on top of acrylics can save you time on large beefy models, and a lot of trouble in your first experiments, because you have to handle smaller and more localized blends, and in general a contained mass of active paint, of which you don't know well the behavior. But this is the next stage of your training as oil painters, and where oils show their true potential. These are all the colors I need for the entire work, and after painting this model, I just kept the palette on my table for the rest of the week, using these same little pools of colors to paint 2 extra models in the spare time between other works. It doesn't matter what I'm painting, black and white are always on the palette, next to my fetish colors Payne's Grey and Payne's Grey Violet. As you can see on the palette, black is not the only color that can bring you to the bottom part of the value scale, and I use these 2 tones everywhere I need that kind of darkness, but without giving up the chromatic information and sensations that black doesn't carry. The original Payne's Grey gives me a cold bluish sensation, and its violet version covers the warm spectrum. It's of course an oversimplification, but it's more than enough to add extra depth and complexity here. Since the whole scheme is based on blue and yellow, I didn't save on the selection of tubes for their progression. 4 colors for the non-metallic yellow-gold, starting with warm earth tones and moving to colder and colder proper yellows, and a selection of lighter and lighter blues that in reality starts from a dark violet, to boost the final contrast between lights and shadows with a clear twist of temperatures. I played a bit more with transparency and opacity of these colors here, but I'll explain better this aspect later. You can argue that I can simply add white to the dark blues, but the result of using a lighter pure pigment or a mix of original pigment plus white is not the same. And this is true even for acrylics or any other kind of paint. Adding white, you are actively diluting the original concentration of pigment, adding also its physical properties, like a bit of its natural chalkiness for example. So try to use white in limited quantities, for small value jumps in the extreme lights for example, and not for your main tones or basic blends. I start the work with the usual quick oil priming. Using acrylics as point of view, I use oils with a reverse flow, in which I start with an extreme and super precise dark definition, pushing and collecting dense paint inside every detail, panel line and junction. I start with the brown tones, because they are the most transparent and the weakest in terms of staining the surface. So I try to maintain their chromatic information, leaving them a bit more on the model. Then I apply a generous coat of black and Payne's Grey on the rifle and the under armor, this time simply giving priority to its depth on the model. I thin down the paint just a bit, because my black and Payne's grey in particular are super dense and difficult to move with the brush straight from the tubes. But in general, I try to keep the paint as thick as I can, because dense paint fills the details with more precision, and it remains in place without easily move outside the target. And I close this step mainly using indigo, the darkest blue in my collection, to prime the rest of the armor. But using also a few touches of violet in the lowest and most hidden parts to keep the idea of a simple environmental light, where all my shadows tend to warm tones and my lights to cold hues. That will passively boost the general cold tone of the blue and the metallic sensation of the techno gold. I move to cleaning as soon as I place the last brushstroke, wiping off the excess of paint that didn't find something to grab firmly. The more complicated the sculpture, the better, because thanks to the physical limits of the big makeup sponge on the shapes of the model, with all the deep details, you get also a good sketch of all the shadows and even dark midtones, especially if you are working on top of a simple value sketch in acrylics, that suddenly becomes something like a grisaille. And all these without considering that those shadows are made by wet, active paint that will blend with every new color you'll put next to them. And since this is always a common question in the comments, this is all the stuff I use to clean the model. So here is the big difference from the oil painting approach I showed you so far. Instead of jumping directly to the application of the extreme values of the scale, creating lights and shadows and generating the midtones from their fusion in the middle, I start applying a base coat of cerulean blue on all the blue parts of the armor. I know, this doesn't seem a big deal seeing this from the perspective of acrylics, where this is how we usually start painting, but this choice has a lot of implications using oils. First, this is not a true base coat. As I mentioned before, all the shadows are filled with the dark hues of indigo and violet, and all that paint starts mixing with cerulean blue as soon as the brush touches the surface. Paying just a bit of attention to the vectors of my brushstrokes, I get a first gentle modulation into the shadows, and, less obvious, even with the lights. To understand better this point, we need to make a little step back to my selection of blue tones. On every tube of oil paint, but this is true also for any other artist paint, it's clearly shown how transparent or opaque the paint is. And knowing this information as a codified and reliable fact, I chose a semi-opaque color able to cover and tint with a good layer the area of application, but still able to become semi-transparent when I stretch it towards lights and shadows. In the lights, the color meets cleaner surfaces and the high values of the zenithal. And in the shadows, the dark values of the zenithal, boosted by the staining power of the dark wash, plus a bit of wet paint for a real and active mix. I get all this with a single step, where I have to apply only a minimal amount of control. Underpainting techniques and opacity tricks are the real soul of oil painting, and we'll explore a ton of this stuff in the next future. But the best part is yet to come. I clean the brush extremely well, using 2 pools of white spirit, so I'm sure there are no residues of blue paint, and I can move to yellow. But let's take another look to the tubes. The dark tones of the yellow spectrum are transparent colors. During the initial wash, the details become opaque anyway, because of the sheer quantity of paint they catch. But on the open areas, I needed only a light staining, and more important, the oily priming. Knowing that my general starting point would have been quite dark, I chose powerful opaque tones, able to cover in bright yellow even the darkest values with a couple of brushstrokes. You'll never find an acrylic yellow able to set a uniform base like this one in a single light pass, without losing anything of its vibrancy and saturation. I know, it's a lot of information to digest. And at this stage, you are probably terrified by the extra level of complexity coming from native opacity and transparency and everything in between. But remember that this stuff works in a very similar way in acrylics, with the extra difficulties, at least in hobby paints, of not knowing how a color behaves when you buy it, or equally common, having access only to super opaque paints, like GW Colors for example. The good news is that all this stuff is in the realm of planning the steps, to make them more efficient and effective. But as you can see, the actual work of hands and brush on the model is basic like applying a base coat. From here, the process, and probably the rest of the video, is quite anticlimactic. Thanks to all the tuning of the preparatory work, the only thing I need to do is to sketch a couple of lights and few extreme shadows on top of the active surface, and almost automatically blend them into a smooth, non-metallic metal. The whole process goes back to the basic application and blend that I showed you on the Orc Shaman, with the huge difference that I'm not painting wet on slightly humid, but with a real wet on wet technique, able to make everything even smoother than usual, because I have two equal masses of active paint mixing on the surface. So perfect for this kind of clean non-metallic metal. The process is basically the same of sketching and smoothing with acrylics. Or, in the correct perspective, this is where sketching and smoothing come from. But with oils, the two steps are extremely close, to the point of becoming a single fluid step when you understand how to use small quantities of paint to apply and at the same time blend new colors on the surface with a single brush and a single motion. I move towards the extreme lights in just a couple of jumps, adding small quantities of white into cerulean blue, and moving to bismuth yellow and then pure white for the gold. In general, I'm quite satisfied with my shadows, but to boost the sensation of a reflective metal, I add little shapes with Prussian blue and violet in few strategic points next to the lights to create a strong contrast. I want the blue to be the main protagonist, so I keep the gold parts less reflective, simply using less powerful contrasts and value jumps. Always keep in mind that your real main tool is the blending brush. Don't worry too much about smoothness or even precision in the application stage, because that should be only a sketch and a quick color blocking, and not the final product. With the different shapes and sizes of the blending brushes, you guide the paint where you need, refining the sketch and quickly creating a glazed effect with few brushstrokes. As a bonus of the spreading process, you get a smooth and clean finish, because the blending brush erases lines and brush marks, stretching that same volume of paint on a larger area. In the last videos I said that we don't use layering with oils, but it's not technically true. It's not a layering aimed to create the illusion of transitions, but you can always overlap layers of paint if you need more or new lights, shadows or reflections, or even freehands. A high contrast is always the key of non-metallic effects. Usually what is perceived as the difficult part of the non-metallic finish is the softening and glazing of the main blocks of lights and shadows. So I wanted to give priority to show how simple this step becomes with oils. Don't worry, soon I'll make a proper video on my take on the topic of non-metallic metal. Moving towards the extreme lights, the reflections become stronger, less blurred, and easier to read as lines and geometric shapes. Setting more precise and localized lights and shadows, the general definition becomes sharper and more evident. And the next natural step is to set edge highlights, extreme glares and reflections, and scratches and battle damages that are visible precisely because the virtual light hits their sharp edges. As always, the palette is the reflection of the work on the model, and you can see how little I worked the colors after the priming wash, and how most of the real work happened in the lights. And here is the final result. Even if the actual process is extremely simple, and you saw the same 2 practical steps in all the last videos, I think this is one of the most efficient in terms of speed painting, where you can see what paint in general can do for you when you understand and use to your advantage all its properties. This was also interesting from the point of view of planning a process and choosing the best tools for the job. After my first test model, I immediately moved to oils, because of the relaxed way in which I'm collecting and painting Infinity, one model at a time in my spare time. Still keeping a speed painting mindset, because I know myself, and I know that if I don't finish a model like this in a single session, well, I'll probably never finish it. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!